The Arizona desert stretched endlessly beneath the pre-dawn sky, silent and ancient. The air hung cold and still, carrying the faint scent of creosote and sage across the sand. In 1962, when the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war and men still measured their worth by what they could do with their hands, an old Cherokee man knelt in the same desert with a rifle carved from walnut wood. Nathan Redwing was 68 years old that morning. His hands were gnarled from 7 decades of hard living, but they were steady as he settled the wooden stock against his shoulder. The rifle had been his grandfather's and his great-grandfather's before that. Every perfect shot taken across 4 generations had been carved into that wood, a living record of knowledge passed down through blood and patience. The target stood 2,600 meters away, a steel plate shimmering in the heat that was already building despite the early hour. Nathan's 6-year-old granddaughter sat cross-legged in the sand beside him, watching with dark eyes that missed nothing. "Watch the mesquite leaves," Nathan said, his voice weathered as desert stone. "The wind tells you everything if you learn its language." The child watched the distant vegetation sway and pulse with invisible currents of air. She saw patterns there, rhythms that her young mind was only beginning to understand. Nathan closed his eyes. His breathing slowed. For nearly a minute, he remained absolutely still, and then his finger moved with quiet certainty. The rifle spoke once. 7 seconds later, the distant steel sang its answer. "Remember this, Kira," Nathan said, opening his eyes. "This land teaches what schools cannot. What I'm giving you isn't just about shooting. It's about listening. It's about patience. It's about respecting what came before you." The old man ran his weathered fingers across the carved stock, tracing the notations left by his ancestors. "One day you'll take the shot I never could, and when you do, they'll finally understand what they tried to bury." Present day, November 21st, 2024, the same desert dawn broke across the Joint Precision Range, painting the sand in shades of amber and gold. The temperature held at 68 degrees perfect for what was to come. A lone figure walked across the hard-pan boots, leaving shallow impressions that would vanish by noon. The Navy SEAL sniper team had arrived an hour earlier, their vehicles arranged in precise formation near the range office. Lieutenant Garrett Holloway stood with his arms crossed, watching the civilian approach. He was 36, lean and weathered from deployments to places whose names still couldn't be spoken in public. Afghanistan had marked him. Iraq had refined him. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he was about to witness. "Standard evaluation," he said to Chief Instructor Wade Brennan, who was adjusting the scope on his MK-13 Mod 7 rifle. "Protocol courtesy for civilian marksmanship enthusiasts. We run them through 1,001 meters, document the results, everyone goes home feeling validated." Brennan grunted acknowledgement. At 39, he'd seen enough range tourists to fill a manual. "That rifle she's carrying looks like it belongs in a museum." "Probably does." Petty Officer Kyle Mercer chimed in, checking his Kestrel 5700 Elite weather meter. The device displayed atmospheric data with precision that would have seemed like magic to shooters a generation ago. Wind steady at 6 miles per hour from the northeast. Temperature stable. Should be easy conditions for everyone. Senior Chief Boone Callahan spat into the sand, his 43 years of hard living evident in every weathered line of his face. "Easy for us. Let's see how she does with that antique." Petty Officer Trent Ashford said nothing. He simply watched the approaching figure with the quiet intensity that had made him the team's best observer. There was something in the way she moved, something deliberate and unhurried, that caught his attention. Commander Russell Hayes emerged from the range office, clipboard in hand. At 52, he'd overseen thousands of evaluations. This would be another routine entry in an endless log. "Gentlemen, our civilian participant is Ms. Kira Redwing. She's requested evaluation at standard distances. Let's maintain professional courtesy and protocol." Colonel Thaddeus Grant stood slightly apart from the group, binoculars hanging from his neck. At 58, with silver hair and the bearing of a man who'd spent his entire adult life in uniform, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd seen the military evolve from Korea-era tactics to modern digital warfare. His father had served in the Korean War. Grant himself had come up through the Cold War years when nuclear annihilation seemed perpetually one mistake away. He watched Kira Redwing approach, and something in his chest tightened with recognition he couldn't quite name. Kira was 32 years old, though the desert sun had weathered her face just enough to make age irrelevant. She wore simple field clothing in earth tones, practical boots that had seen considerable use, and she carried the wooden-stocked rifle with the ease of someone who'd been holding it since childhood. The rifle drew every eye. The stock was honey-colored walnut polished smooth by generations of hands. It glowed in the morning light like something alive. But it was the carvings that made men stare. Every inch of that wood was covered in intricate notations, symbols, and measurements that seemed to flow across the grain in patterns both beautiful and mysterious. The barrel was modern, a professionally fitted 375 Shaytac configuration that spoke of serious capability. A Night Force Attack-TR 735-56 scope sat mounted in precision rings, an Atlas BT-10 bipod folded beneath the forend. But that wooden stock transformed the entire weapon into something that belonged to another era, another way of understanding the world. Holloway stepped forward, extending his hand. "Ms. Redwing, I'm Lieutenant Holloway. Welcome to the range." Her handshake was firm, but not aggressive. "Thank you for accommodating me, Lieutenant." "That's quite a rifle," Brennan said, unable to help himself. "Family heirloom." "5 generations," Kira replied simply. "My great-great-great-grandfather carved the first calculations into this stock in 1850. Buffalo hunter in Montana Territory. Each generation since has added their knowledge." Mercer's eyebrows rose. "Calculations? You mean those carvings are data? Every perfect shot," Kira said, running her fingers across the wood with obvious affection. "Wind compensations, distance, notations, temperature, coefficients, humidity factors. Cherokee notation system modified for ballistics. 174 years of accumulated knowledge." Callahan couldn't quite suppress his skeptical grunt. Kira heard it but showed no reaction, and something about her calm acceptance made Callahan feel suddenly small. Grant stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the carvings. He pulled a small magnifying glass from his pocket and examined the stock with the intensity of a man reading scripture. For a long moment he said nothing, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made the SEALs pay attention. "This isn't a firearm," Grant said quietly. "This is an encyclopedia." The morning air began to warm as Commander Hayes briefed the evaluation protocol. Standard procedure. Distance markers at 1,000 and 1,500 meters. 5 shots at each distance. Documentation of group size and accuracy. Professional courtesy extended to civilian participants who requested military facility access. The SEAL team prepared their shooting positions with practiced efficiency. Each man carried an Mk13 Mod 7 rifle chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum, equipped with Schmidt & Bender PM22 525-56 scopes. They had Vectronics PLR F-25C, laser rangefinders, Kestrel weather stations, and applied ballistics software that could calculate firing solutions faster than most men could think. Modern warfare compressed into technology so advanced it would have seemed like sorcery to the men who had stormed Normandy. Holloway settled into his shooting position, first his body forming perfect alignment behind the rifle. He'd made shots like this 10,000 times in training and in combat. The routine was muscle memory now, as natural as breathing. He glanced at his dope card, confirmed his calculations, and sent 5 rounds downrange in smooth succession. The spotting scope confirmed what he already knew. 5 hits, tight group, all within 6 inches of center mass at 1,000 meters. Brennan followed. Then Mercer, then Callahan, then Ashford. Each man executed with a precision that justified their position among the Navy's elite. Their rifles spoke with mechanical authority, and the distant steel plates rang in response. Professional competence demonstrated without flair or wasted motion. Then it was Kira's turn. She walked to the firing line with that same unhurried pace, carrying the wooden rifle like it weighed nothing. She set her pack down carefully and began what appeared to be a ritual of preparation that the SEALs had never witnessed before. First, she walked 50 yards to the left of the firing line. She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds completely still, her eyes closed. Then she walked 50 yards to the right and repeated the process. When she returned to center, she knelt down and removed her boots. Callahan exchanged glances with Mercer. The younger man shrugged, mystified. Kira pressed her bare feet into the desert sand. The Kelly-Shea hardpan beneath the surface layer was cool against her skin. She knelt there, both palms flat on the ground, and closed her eyes. 45 seconds passed. Nobody spoke. When her eyes opened, something had changed in her expression, a stillness that went deeper than mere calm. She pulled a small leather pouch from her pack and sprinkled sand from it at 3 different locations. She watched how the grains dispersed in the air, studying the patterns with intense focus. Then she tasted the air, actually touched her tongue to her lips, as if sampling the atmosphere itself. The SEALs watched all of this with professional restraint, but the skepticism was there. Years of training, billions of dollars in equipment, the most advanced ballistic technology on Earth. And this civilian was tasting the air and playing with sand. Kira settled into her shooting position. The wooden stock found her shoulder like it had been carved for that exact purpose, which, in a sense, it had. 4 generations of Red Wings had refined the dimensions until the fit was nearly perfect for anyone with similar build. She made no calculations on paper. She consulted no ballistic computer. She didn't check the Kestrel data that Mercer would have happily shared. She simply breathed. 4 count in, hold. 4 count out, hold. The rhythm of her breathing matched something in the desert air itself, a pulse that perhaps only she could feel. Her finger found the trigger. Pressure built gradually, smoothly, inevitably. The wooden rifle spoke. The sound was different from the modern rifles. Deeper, somehow more resonant, as if the wood itself remembered every shot it had ever fired and added that history to each new report. 700 milliseconds later, the steel plate at 1,000 meters rang with perfect center mass impact. Brennan, spotting through his scope, blinked. Dead center. Kira worked the bolt, chambered a new round, and settled again into that same breathing rhythm. Another shot, another perfect hit. 5 shots, 5 identical impacts so close together that the spotting scope could barely distinguish individual marks. Holloway lowered his binoculars slowly. "Well," he said carefully, "that was well executed." Kira stood, brushing sand from her knees. "Thank you, Lieutenant." "How did you—" Mercer started, then stopped. He wasn't sure how to phrase the question without sounding either impressed or insulting. "How did I calculate the hold without instruments?" Kira asked, reading his expression easily. "I didn't calculate. I listened." "Listen to what?" Callahan asked, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. Kira gestured at the vast expanse of desert around them. "To this, the sand tells you wind direction and speed if you know how to read the dispersion patterns. The temperature differential between ground and air creates pressure variations you can feel on your skin. The vegetation movement shows you wind layers. The desert provides every answer if you develop the patience to hear it." She said it simply, without condescension or pride, stating facts as obvious as sunrise. Commander Hayes called the 1,500-meter distance. The heat was building now, approaching 90 degrees, and the mirage was becoming visible across the flat desert floor. Those wavering columns of heat distortion could make long-range shooting treacherous, turning clear targets into shimmering illusions. The SEAL team adjusted their calculations accordingly. Brennan consulted his ballistic computer, cross-referencing atmospheric data with preloaded profiles. Mercer took fresh wind readings at multiple heights using his handheld weather station. Holloway updated his dope card with the new environmental factors. They shot well. All of them. Years of training ensured that much. But the mirage was proving difficult and introducing variables that even sophisticated software struggled to compensate for perfectly. The hits were good, clustered within the acceptable range, but not the surgical precision they'd achieved at 1,000 meters. Kira prepared in her same methodical way. More sand dispersed and studied. More stillness with bare feet pressed to earth. More of that breathing rhythm that seemed to sync with invisible forces. The wind shifted while she was preparing. 8 miles per hour from the northeast, then suddenly 6 miles per hour from due east. A gust pattern that the Kestrel captured in its digital memory, but that Kira seemed to feel in her body. She adjusted her position by perhaps 2 inches. Nothing more. 5 shots. 5 perfect center mass hits at 1,500 meters, threading through the mirage like it didn't exist. Brennan rechecked his atmospheric data, convinced he must have missed something that would explain how she compensated so perfectly. The numbers were right there in his hand, processed by software that incorporated decades of ballistic research. And yet this woman with a wooden rifle and bare feet had outshot the technology. "Luck," Callahan muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Ashford said nothing. He simply watched Kira with that same quiet intensity, And in his mind, he was remembering his grandfather. Montana, the Absaroka Mountains. An old man teaching a young boy to read elk behavior by watching how they responded to wind and weather. Knowledge that Ashford had dismissed as outdated when he discovered laser rangefinders and ballistic computers. Knowledge that was suddenly looking a lot less outdated. Colonel Grant approached Kira during the break between distances. The other SEALs were checking their equipment, discussing the Mirage challenges, but Grant moved with purpose toward the woman with the wooden rifle. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the weapon. Kira handed it over carefully. Grant accepted it with the reverence it deserved. He examined the carvings with his magnifying glass, tracing the lines and symbols with one finger. His expression changed as understanding dawned. These weren't decorative patterns. They were encoded data, wind velocities marked in Cherokee-modified notation, range compensations calculated across generations of practical experience, temperature coefficients derived not from laboratory testing, but from actual shots taken in actual conditions. 174 years of knowledge compressed into wood. "Your great-great-great-grandfather," Grant said slowly. "Buffalo Hunter, Montana Territory, 1850s. "Yes, sir," Kira confirmed. He was shooting at distances that most military snipers today would consider extreme. "He had to, sir. Buffalo herds learned to stay beyond rifle range. The hunters who adapted survived. The ones who didn't starved." Grant traced one particular carving, a complex spiral pattern that incorporated multiple variables. "This notation here, this is for night shooting, isn't it? Using star positions to calculate wind drift." Kira's eyes widened slightly. "You can read it." "I can recognize it," Grant said carefully. "Your grandfather was Nathan Redwing." It wasn't a question. "You knew him." Kira's voice carried surprise that she couldn't quite hide. "By reputation, I was 18 years old, fresh Army lieutenant in 1964, Cold War at its peak. Nathan was contracted briefly for desert operation training in Nevada. They needed someone who understood this environment at an instinctive level." Grant's expression darkened. They wouldn't let him officially instruct, 1964 attitudes being what they were. "Because he was Cherokee," Kira said quietly. "Because bureaucracy and prejudice are often the same thing." Grant handed the rifle back with obvious reluctance. "He was the finest desert fieldcraft specialist I ever encountered." When he separated from contract service in 1967, they buried his methodologies, called them unreliable, unscientific. Holloway had drifted closer, listening. "What kind of methodologies, sir?" Grant gestured at the desert around them. "Everything you just watched Ms. Redwing demonstrate. Reading wind by observation instead of instruments. Calculating temperature effects by feel instead of data. Understanding the land itself as the primary source of information." "That sounds like guesswork," Brennan said, trying to reconcile this with his training. "It's the opposite of guesswork," Grant replied. "It's accumulated knowledge refined across generations. Your ballistic computer has data from maybe 20 years of laboratory testing. That rifle has data from 174 years of real-world application. Which would you trust?" Silence settled over the group. Mercer broke it, his voice careful. "Ma'am, would you consider teaching us what you're doing, if that's appropriate to ask?" Kira looked at the wooden rifle in her hands, touching the carvings that represented her family's legacy. "My grandfather would have wanted his knowledge to continue living." "Yes, I'll teach you." Commander Hayes stepped forward, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes showing something that might have been curiosity. "Ms. Redwing's standard evaluation protocol concludes at 1,500 meters. However," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "Lieutenant Holloway has requested permission to extend the evaluation to 3,000 meters. "Sir, that exceeds standard parameters," Brennan interjected. "I'm aware, Chief." Hayes looked at Kira. "Ms. Redwing, are you willing to attempt longer distances? There's no requirement that you do so. Your performance thus far has been exceptional." Kira's fingers traced the carvings on her rifle stock, finding a space near the grip that had been deliberately left blank. Unmarked wood waiting for something. "I made a promise to attempt the shot my grandfather never took," she said. "Yes, sir, I'm willing." Holloway exchanged glances with his team. "With respect, sir, If we're extending to 3,000 meters, this becomes something other than courtesy evaluation. We're talking about distances that test doctrine. Agreed, Hayes said, which is why I'm officially approving this as an extended evaluation. Colonel Grant will document for the record. Gentlemen, this is now a professional assessment of advanced marksmanship techniques. Conduct yourselves accordingly. Callahan, to his credit, nodded acceptance. Understood, sir. The range markers for 2,000 meters stood twice as far as anything the civilian evaluation protocol typically covered. At this distance, the mirage became severe, creating waves of distortion that could make a target appear to float and dance. The slightest miscalculation in wind reading would send a bullet feet off target. The SEAL team prepared with intense focus. This was approaching the edge of their training envelope distances they'd practiced, but not mastered. Each man consulted his equipment, cross-referenced his data, and took his time establishing the perfect firing solution. Holloway shot first. The round impacted 18 inches right of center. He'd misread the wind layer. Brennan adjusted based on Holloway's impact, compensated accordingly, and hit within 8 inches of center. Respectable given the conditions. Mercer took nearly 4 minutes of preparation running multiple software calculations. His shot hit 12 inches low. The mirage had fooled even his careful analysis. Callahan's round found the edge of the steel, barely a qualifying hit. Ashford, the quiet observer, took his time. He studied the vegetation movement with unusual intensity, trying to apply what he'd watched Kira do. His shot impacted 6 inches from center. The best of the group. Then Kira stepped to the line. She performed her ritual with even greater care at this distance, walking the pattern, removing her boots, pressing her feet and hands to the earth, studying the sand dispersal with such focus that she seemed to enter a meditative state. The SEALs watched in silence. Whatever skepticism remained was being eroded by simple curiosity. This wasn't some mystical ceremony. She was gathering data, they realized, information that their instruments couldn't capture because it required a different kind of attention. Kira settled behind her rifle. The wooden stock fit her like a custom-tailored suit. She pressed her cheek to the wood that her grandfather's cheek had touched, that her great-grandfather's cheek had touched back through the generations until the connection felt almost sacred. Her breathing found its rhythm. 4 count in, hold, 4 count out, hold. Somewhere in her mind, she heard her grandfather's voice from that morning in 1962. Watch the mesquite leaves. The wind tells you everything if you learn its language. She watched, she listened, she felt. The wooden rifle spoke. Perfect center mass at 2,000 meters. 4 more shots followed, each one taking its time, each one finding the center with precision that seemed to defy the atmospheric chaos. Brennan lowered his spotting scope. How is that possible? She's reading something we're not, Ashford said quietly. Look at how she studies the vegetation before each shot. She's not just checking wind direction. She's reading the entire wind column, surface layer, mid-level, upper level. She's seeing the 3-dimensional structure of the air. Mercer looked at his Kestrel. The device gave him wind data at his location, but it couldn't tell him how the wind changed at 500 meters out, or 1,000 meters, or 1,500 meters. That required calculation and guesswork. Or it required knowing how to read the land itself. At 2,500 meters, the heat reached its peak, 108 degrees Fahrenheit. The mirage was so severe that the target seemed to shimmer and shift like something seen through troubled water. Even identifying the exact location of the steel plate became difficult. The SEAL team struggled, not from lack of skill or effort, but because they were operating at the edge of what their training and technology could reliably accomplish. Brennan's ballistic computer gave conflicting readings as the atmospheric density fluctuated. Mercer's wind measurements showed variations that his software couldn't reconcile into a coherent firing solution. Holloway's shot drifted 3 feet right. Brennan hit the edge. Mercer missed entirely. Callahan's round impacted 2 feet low. Ashford, applying every observation technique he'd learned from watching Kira, managed to hit 8 inches from center. Respectable given the impossible conditions. Kira took 15 minutes to prepare. She walked out nearly 100 yards from the firing line, studying the terrain with such intensity that she seemed to memorize every stone and bush. She returned, pressed herself to the earth, and remained motionless for so long that Callahan wondered if she'd fallen asleep. When she finally settled behind the rifle, her expression held a certainty that transcended confidence. This wasn't belief that she would hit. This was knowledge that the shot was already complete, that she was simply executing what the land had already shown her. The wooden rifle spoke 5 times, 5 perfect center mass hits at 500 meters. Callahan stood up from his spotting position, removed his ball cap, and ran his hand through his sweat-soaked hair. "I've been shooting professionally for 20 years," he said to no one in particular. "I'm learning more watching her in 3 hours than I learned in my entire SEAL sniper school qualification." "Technology tells us what happened," Ashford said, his voice carrying a note of revelation. "She's reading what's happening right now, this exact moment. By the time our instruments give us data, the conditions have already changed. She's responding in real time to information we can't even see." Brennan looked at his ballistic computer, at the sophisticated software that represented decades of research and development. Then he looked at the wooden rifle with its hand-carved data spanning nearly 2 centuries. "I think we've been solving the wrong problem," he said quietly. Commander Hayes consulted with Colonel Grant briefly, then turned to address the group. "Gentlemen, Ms. Redwing has requested extension to 3,000 meters. This significantly exceeds standard evaluation parameters and approaches the limits of routine SEAL sniper training." "Sir," Holloway said carefully, "we know our limitations. If you're asking whether we should attempt the 3,000 meters, I'll be honest. That's going to test us severely." "I'm not asking you to attempt it, Lieutenant. I'm asking if you're willing to observe and document." Hayes looked at Kira. "Ms. Redwing, 3,000 meters represents an extreme distance. The conditions are brutal. There's no shame in stopping here. You've already demonstrated extraordinary capability." Kira touched the blank space on her rifle stock, that unmarked section of wood waiting to be carved. "My grandfather calculated a shot at 3,800 meters in 1961. He never got to take it. I promised I would try." The number hung in the air like a physical thing. 3,800 meters, over 2 miles, a distance that exceeded even the most extreme confirmed military kills. Grant's expression changed, something moving behind his eyes that looked like memory and regret. 1961, he repeated softly. "Nevada." Kira's head snapped toward him. "You know about that?" "I know the operation was classified until 2018, Grant said carefully. "I know your grandfather was assigned a shot he never took because command didn't trust a civilian contractor for something that critical." His voice carried decades of bitterness. "I know they sent a 4-man team instead and all 4 missed. I know the entire operation was compromised and as a result." "He never told me the details," Kira said. "Just that there was a shot at 3,800 meters that he'd prepared for, that he'd calculated every variable, that he'd left space on the rifle for that notation, but the opportunity never came." "The opportunity was taken from him," Grant corrected. "They blamed him for the mission failure. Put it in his file that his methodology was unproven and unreliable. Effectively blacklisted him from any future contract work." Holloway felt something tighten in his chest. How many times had he seen good men destroyed by bureaucratic politics? How many capable people had been discarded because they didn't fit someone's narrow definition of acceptable? "So this isn't just about shooting," he said, understanding dawning. "This is about clearing his name." "This is about finishing his work," Kira replied. "About proving that what he knew, what my family has preserved for nearly 200 years, has value, that it deserves to be remembered." Silence settled over the range. The morning had become something more than a routine evaluation. They all felt it now. Hayes looked at his watch. "It's approaching noon. Heat will become prohibitive within the hour. We'll suspend operations resume at dawn tomorrow. Ms. Redwing, you have tonight to consider whether you want to attempt distances beyond 3,000 meters. Gentlemen, you have tonight to think about what you've witnessed today." As the group dispersed, preparing to leave the range for the evening, Colonel Grant caught up with Kira. She was carefully packing her rifle in a worn canvas case, treating the weapon with the same reverence someone might show a religious text. "Your grandfather saved my life," Grant said without preamble. Kira stopped, looked up at him. "Nevada, 1964, I was lost during a training exercise. Lost doesn't even cover it. I was 70 miles off course, no radio contact, water nearly gone. Nathan found me by reading the land. He tracked my path by disturbed sand, by how the vegetation had been brushed by signs I didn't even know I was leaving. He saved my life, and in my official report, I never mentioned his name. Why not? The question carried no judgment, only curiosity. Because I was 20 years old and didn't understand how the system worked. Because my commanding officer made it clear that crediting a civilian contractor would make me look incompetent. Because I was more concerned with my career than with giving honor where it was due. Grant's voice was heavy with regret. I'm 58 now. I've spent 38 years wishing I'd done things differently. Kira was quiet for a long moment. He wouldn't have expected credit. That wasn't why he did what he did. I know, which somehow makes it worse. Grant looked out at the desert, at the heat shimmer already distorting the distant mountains. Tomorrow, if you take that 800-meter shot, I'm documenting everything. I'm submitting a formal report that will go into official military records. Nathan Redwing's name will be in that report. His methods will be described in detail. And I'm going to recommend that his contract service records be amended to reflect what actually happened in 1961. Can you do that? Kira asked. After all this time, I'm a colonel with 39 years of service and nothing left to lose, Grant replied. I can make a lot of noise, and noise sometimes gets things done. But only if you make that shot. Only if we can prove beyond any question that his methodology works at extreme distance. Kira finished packing her rifle. Then I'll make the shot. For him. For all of us, they never acknowledged. The SEAL team gathered at their vehicles, the day's events still processing in their minds. Holloway looked at his rifle, at the sophisticated optic, and the precision machining, and the polymer stock that represented the cutting edge of modern firearms technology. Then he thought about a wooden rifle carved in 1850, updated and refined across 5 generations, carrying knowledge that had been earned shot by shot across nearly 2 centuries. We've been doing this wrong, he said to Brennan. What do you mean? We've been so focused on technology that we forgot the fundamentals. We use instruments to tell us about the environment instead of learning to read the environment directly. We've put ourselves between the land and the shot, and maybe that's the problem. Mercer was checking his Kestrel, reviewing the day's data logs. Our equipment gives us precision we couldn't achieve otherwise. Does it? Ashford asked quietly. She outshot all of us at every distance. With no computer, no weather station, no laser rangefinder, just observation and knowledge passed down through her family. That's not exactly fair, Brennan protested. She's got generational experience we can't replicate. Why not? Holloway asked. Why can't we learn what she knows? Why can't we integrate those observation skills with our technology? Why does it have to be one or the other? No one had an answer for that. Callahan, who'd been quiet since his comment on the range, spoke up. My grandfather worked construction, built bridges. He could look at a span and tell you if it would hold just by reading the stress patterns in the metal, could do calculations in his head that engineers needed computers for. We called it experience, intuition, but it wasn't magic. It was pattern recognition developed over decades. He paused. What if that's what we're seeing? Not some mystical connection to nature, but simply pattern recognition refined across generations until it looks effortless. Then it's something we can learn, Holloway said, if we're willing to set aside our pride and admit we don't know everything. That night, Kira sat alone in her hotel room with the wooden rifle across her lap. She ran her fingers over the carvings, reading them like Braille, feeling the history contained in every notch and line. Her grandfather's voice echoed in memory. One day you'll take the shot I never could. Tomorrow. Dawn. 3,000 meters first to establish the baseline. Then if conditions allowed, if courage held, if the land provided its answers, she would attempt the shot that Nathan Redwing had calculated but never taken. 800 meters. 2.36 miles. A shot that would take over 7 seconds to reach its target, crossing multiple wind layers, fighting gravity and air resistance, and every physical force that tried to drag the bullet off course. A shot that would either vindicate her grandfather's legacy or prove that some distances were simply too far for human skill to bridge. She touched the blank space on the rifle stock, imagining the carving she would add if she succeeded. The final notation in a journal that had been written across nearly 2 centuries. I won't fail you, grandfather, she whispered to the empty room. They'll remember. They'll all remember. Outside, the desert night was vast and silent, holding its breath for what the dawn would bring. The Arizona dawn arrived with the same patient inevitability it had brought for millennia. The sky lightened from black to deep purple to pale gold, and the temperature held steady at 71 degrees. The desert air was so still that individual grains of sand seemed suspended in time, waiting for something to disturb their ancient rest. Kira Redwing had been awake since 4 in the morning, performing the rituals her grandfather had taught her. She'd faced east and spoken the old prayers in Cherokee words that connected her to ancestors who'd hunted these lands before the United States existed. She'd cleaned her rifle with the same cloth her grandfather had used, the fabric worn soft as skin from decades of careful use. And she'd studied the blank space on the wooden stock, that unmarked section of walnut that waited for the final chapter of a story begun in 1850. The SEAL team arrived at the range with a different energy than the previous day. The casual confidence had been replaced by something more complex. Respect certainly, but also curiosity, of the kind that drove men to master new skills. They were warriors who'd built their lives on constant improvement, on never accepting that they'd reached the limits of their capability. Watching Kira Redwing shoot had shown them limits they hadn't known existed, and that revelation had sparked something in each of them. Lieutenant Garrett Holloway carried his rifle differently this morning. He'd spent half the night reviewing ballistic theory, reading research papers on environmental effects on long-range shooting, trying to understand the gap between what his equipment told him and what the land apparently communicated to someone who knew how to listen. Chief Instructor Wade Brennan had left his ballistic computer in his vehicle. He'd decided to shoot this morning using only his own observations, testing whether decades of experience could substitute for software analysis. The decision made him feel both liberated and terrified. Petty Officer Kyle Mercer still had his Kestrel 5700, but he was watching the desert vegetation with new attention, trying to correlate what the instrument measured with what the natural environment revealed. Senior Chief Boone Callahan had barely slept. His mind kept returning to his grandfather, to lessons learned and then dismissed as outdated. He wondered how much knowledge his family had lost by believing that technology made experience obsolete. Petty Officer Trent Ashford had spent the evening on the phone with his father, asking about his grandfather's hunting techniques. The conversation had unlocked memories he'd suppressed, skills he'd been taught as a boy and then abandoned. He felt like he was remembering a language he'd once been fluent in, but had forgotten through disuse. Colonel Thaddeus Grant arrived carrying a professional video camera in addition to his usual binoculars. Whatever happened today would be documented with the thoroughness of a historical record. He owed Nathan Redwing that much. He owed himself that much. Commander Russell Hayes reviewed his evaluation protocols one final time, knowing that what was about to unfold would likely require him to write a report unlike any he'd submitted in 30 years of service. The range stretched before them, markers extending to distances that tested the boundaries of human capability. At 3,500 meters, the steel target was barely visible, even through high-powered optics, a shimmer of metal in the morning light that could easily be mistaken for mirage distortion. "Gentlemen, Ms. Redwing," Hayes announced, his voice carrying across the quiet range. "We're extending today's evaluation to 3,500 meters. This distance approaches documented world record territory. I want everyone to understand the technical reality we're facing." He gestured at the distant target. At 3,500 meters, bullet flight time exceeds 6.9 seconds. Total drop approaches 44 feet. A 5-mile-per-hour wind error results in multiple feet of horizontal drift. The margin of error at this distance exceeds the dimensions of the target itself. Mathematically, we're operating in a space where perfect execution is not sufficient. The shot requires what I can only describe as impossible precision. The SEALs listened with the attention of men who understood they were about to witness something extraordinary, whether success or failure. Kira stood slightly apart, her wooden rifle held loosely, her attention already reaching out across the desert toward the distant steel. She was beginning the process of reading the land, a practice that would take hours and required patience that technology had trained most people to abandon. "The SEAL team will shoot first," Hayes continued. "Standard protocol. Ms. Redwing will shoot last. Are there any questions?" Silence answered him. "Then let's begin." The evaluation of limits had commenced. Holloway settled into his shooting position with meticulous care. He'd cross-checked his atmospheric data 3 times, verified his range measurement with 2 different instruments, and calculated his firing solution using both his primary and backup ballistic software. The numbers agreed. He had confidence in his preparation. He controlled his breathing, let his heart rate settle and press the trigger with the smoothness of 10,000 hours of practice. The Mk-13 Mod 7 rifle spoke with authority. Through his scope, Holloway watched the bullets trace the faint shimmer in the air that marked its passage. 6.9 seconds that felt like an eternity. The impact came 38 inches right of center. Holloway's jaw tightened. He'd misread the wind layers, allowed his calculations to override what subtle environmental cues he'd actually observed. The computer had told him one thing. The land had shown him another. He'd trusted the wrong source. Brennan shot next, attempting to compensate based on Holloway's impact. His round struck 32 inches low. The ballistic drop calculation had been accurate in theory, but the actual air density wasn't matching his model's predictions. The software worked from averages and standards. The desert operated on its own terms. Mercer took 9 minutes to prepare his shot. He ran multiple software analyses, cross-referenced his data, checked and rechecked every variable. His Kestrel gave him wind readings. His laser rangefinder gave him exact distance. His ballistic calculator gave him a precise firing solution based on decades of research and testing. His bullet missed the target entirely, passing 4 feet left of the steel. The young operator sat back from his rifle, his expression showing the first cracks in his technological faith. Everything he'd been taught, every tool he'd been given, had failed him at the moment of truth. Not because the equipment was faulty, but because the variables were too complex, too dynamic, too immediate for any calculation performed even seconds ago to remain valid. Callahan approached his shot with grim determination. He'd been shooting longer than any of them, had more deployments, more real-world experience under pressure. He trusted his instincts in a way the younger operators hadn't yet learned. His round struck the extreme top edge of the target. Barely a qualifying hit, more luck than precision, but at this distance, he'd take whatever the desert was willing to give. Ashford was the last SEAL to shoot. He'd been watching Kira throughout the morning, studying how she moved, how she prepared, how she seemed to enter a state of intense focus that went beyond normal concentration. He tried to apply what he'd observed, spending 5 minutes just watching the vegetation patterns, feeling the temperature variations on his exposed skin, listening to the subtle sounds of wind moving across the terrain features. His shot impacted 9 inches from center, the best of the SEAL attempts by a significant margin. Holloway clapped Ashford on the shoulder. "How?" "I stopped trying to calculate," Ashford replied quietly. "I just watched and responded. Didn't think about it, just felt it. Probably can't explain it better than that." "You're learning," Colonel Grant said, and there was approval in his voice that made Ashford stand a little straighter. Then all eyes turned to Kira Redwing. She'd been preparing throughout the SEALs' attempts, but her preparation looked nothing like theirs. Where they'd consulted instruments, in calculations she'd been walking. A pattern across the desert that seemed almost ceremonial in its deliberation. She'd walked to cardinal points, north and south and east and west, standing at each location for long minutes with her eyes closed. She'd knelt at a dozen different spots, pressing her hands to the sand, reading information the earth provided through nothing more than direct contact. Now she returned to the firing line, and her bare feet left shallow impressions in the sand that would vanish with the first wind. She settled beside her rifle but didn't touch it yet. Instead, she performed the same ritual of sand dispersal she'd done the previous day but at a larger scale. 3 different heights, 5 different locations, watching each dispersal pattern with such intensity that she seemed to memorize every individual grain's trajectory. The watching SEALs said nothing. Whatever skepticism had remained yesterday was gone now, burned away by their own failures at this distance. They were witnessing a master at work, and they knew enough to be silent in the presence of mastery. Kira tasted the air again. Not a casual gesture, but a deliberate act of measurement. She was determining humidity with a precision that matched or exceeded any hygrometer, using biological sensors refined across hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution and then trained through personal practice. She knelt beside her rifle and pressed both palms flat to the sand, her eyes closed. 2 full minutes passed, her breathing so slow and controlled that her chest barely moved. When her eyes opened, something had changed in her expression. The focus had deepened to a level that seemed almost supernatural, though it was nothing more than complete presence, in the moment absolute attention to the task at hand. She settled behind the wooden rifle, and the stock found her shoulder with the ease of long familiarity. Her cheek pressed to the walnut that her grandfather's cheek had pressed, that his grandfather's cheek had pressed back through generations until the connection felt less like inheritance and more like continuity. 4-count breathing. In, hold, out, hold. Her finger found the trigger. The desert seemed to hold its breath. The wooden rifle spoke. 7 seconds of flight. 7 seconds during which the bullet crossed layers of air at different temperatures, different pressures, different velocities. 7 seconds during which every variable that could affect trajectory did affect it in ways too complex for any computer to fully model. 7 seconds during which Kira Redwing's calculation performed not through mathematics, but through accumulated generational knowledge and direct environmental observation, either proved valid or proved insufficient. The steel plate rang with perfect center mass impact. Brennan, watching through his spotting scope, forgot to breathe. Dead center, absolute dead center. Kira worked the bolt smoothly, chambering another round. She didn't pause for celebration or acknowledgement. This was work, and the work wasn't finished. 4 more shots followed. Each one took time to read the subtle shifts in environmental conditions. The wind changed between shots, the temperature climbed slightly, the mirage began to intensify as the sun rose higher. Each shot found the center of the steel with precision that seemed to mock the laws of probability. 5 perfect hits at 3,500 meters. Mercer set down his kestrel and just stared. His entire worldview, built on data and calculation and technological superiority, was crumbling. Not because technology was useless, but because he'd made it into a religion and forgotten that it was just a tool. Tools had limitations. The human eye and mind and body, properly trained, properly attuned, had different limitations. Sometimes fewer limitations. Callahan stood and walked to where Kira was carefully clearing her rifle. He removed his ball cap, a gesture of respect that in military culture carried profound meaning. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. "I'm 43 years old. I've been shooting since I was 8. I've been a SEAL for 23 years. And I just realized I don't know a damn thing." Kira looked up at him, her expression gentle. "You know plenty, Senior Chief. You just learned it in a different language. What I'm doing isn't better than what you know. It's complementary. Your technology gives you a starting point. My methods let me refine that starting point in real time. Together, they'd be even more powerful than either one alone." The simplicity of that statement, delivered without arrogance or judgment, hit Callahan harder than any criticism could have. She wasn't claiming superiority. She was offering partnership. "Will you teach us?" Holloway asked, and the request carried the weight of command, acknowledging a higher authority. "I mean formally, not just observation, but actual instruction in your methods." Kira touched the wooden stock of her rifle, running her fingers across the carvings. "My grandfather would have wanted this knowledge to continue. He believed that skills shouldn't die with their practitioners. Yes, I'll teach you, but you need to understand something first." She gestured at the desert around them. "This isn't quick learning. It's not a weekend course or a certification program. What you're asking to learn took me 26 years to begin to understand, and I'm still learning. My grandfather studied his entire life and said at the end that he'd only scratched the surface. This is a lifetime practice." "We understand," Ashford said quietly, "or at least we're beginning to." Grant had been filming the entire sequence, documenting every preparation ritual, every shot, every result. Now he lowered the camera and approached Kira with an expression that mixed respect and something that might have been redemption. "Your grandfather was assigned a shot at 3,800 meters in 1961, Grant said. "Nevada test range, Cold War operation, Soviet observation post monitoring our nuclear testing program. The shot was calculated, planned, prepared." Nathan spent 3 days reading that desert, mapping every terrain feature, documenting wind patterns hour by hour. Kira's attention sharpened. "He never told me the full story." "Because it was classified until 2018, and by then he'd been gone for years." Grant's voice carried decades of bitterness. "Command made the decision 72 hours before execution. They didn't trust a civilian contractor with a shot of that strategic importance. Didn't matter that Nathan had more relevant experience than anyone in the military. Didn't matter that he'd proven his capability repeatedly. He was civilian, he was Cherokee, he was outside the chain of command. So they sent a 4-man SEAL team instead." Holloway felt something cold settle in his stomach. He knew where this story was going. All four missed, Grant continued. The Soviet observers detected the team. Entire operation compromised. Intelligence value lost. And in the after-action report, they blamed Nathan. Said his methodology was unproven, his calculations unreliable, his approach fundamentally unscientific. They blacklisted him from any future contract work, effectively destroyed his reputation within the military community. He never said, Kira whispered. He just told me there was a shot he'd prepared for but never took. I thought it was about lost opportunity, not stolen opportunity. It was stolen, Grant said flatly. Stolen by prejudice and bureaucratic arrogance. And Nathan carried that undeserved shame until he died. He paused, meeting Kira's eyes directly. I'm telling you this because if you attempt 800 meters tomorrow, you're not just proving your own skill. You're vindicating him. You're correcting a 63-year-old injustice. The weight of that statement settled over everyone present. This had transcended marksmanship evaluation. This had become about honor and legacy and the debts that institutions owe to the individuals they wrong. Hayes stepped forward, his official bearings somehow more pronounced. Ms. Redwing, I need to be clear about something. If you successfully execute a shot at 800 meters under proper observation and documentation, I will submit a formal report to the Department of Defense. That report will include complete historical context regarding your grandfather's 1961 assignment. I will recommend that his contract service record be amended to remove the negative notation and replace it with proper acknowledgement of his capability. Can you do that? Kira asked. After all this time, I can initiate the process, Hayes replied. Colonel Grant's documentation will support it. The evidence of your capability, using his exact methodology, will make the case difficult to dismiss. It won't be quick. Military bureaucracy moves slowly, but it can be done. Kira looked at the blank space on her rifle stock, the empty space that Nathan Redwing had left for a shot he'd calculated but never taken. A space waiting for over 6 decades to be filled. Then I'll take the shot, she said quietly. For him, for everyone who had their capabilities dismissed because they didn't fit someone's narrow expectations. The teaching began that afternoon during the hours when the heat made shooting impractical, but observation remained possible. Kira led the SEAL team through the desert, moving slowly, stopping frequently, demonstrating the subtle signs that revealed environmental information. See that creosote bush, she said, pointing to vegetation about 200 meters away. Watch how the branches move. The team watched. To untrained eyes, it was just a bush swaying in wind like any other bush. But as they continued to observe, patterns emerged. The movement wasn't random. It pulsed rhythmic variations that indicated wind coming in waves rather than steady pressure. There's a low ridge line about 800 meters beyond that bush, Kira explained. The wind hits the ridge, deflects upward, creates a turbulent zone. Then it settles back down, creating a pulse pattern. If I'm shooting across that zone, I need to time my shot for the low point of the pulse cycle. How did you know there's a ridge line there? Mercer asked. You can't see it from here. I walked there this morning at dawn. I map terrain features physically when possible. When I can't walk the ground, I use topographic maps and then verify with observation. The vegetation patterns tell you about terrain you can't see. Different plants grow in different elevations and water conditions. You can read the landscape by reading the plants. She led them to a patch of bare sand. Now watch this. She sprinkled sand from her pouch, released it from waist height. The grains dispersed in a specific pattern, more drift to the right than the left, but with a slight curl at the end. What did you just learn? She asked. Ashford answered. Wind from the left, about 5 to 7 miles per hour, with a cross current creating that curl pattern. Good. What else? Silent. They looked at the sand pattern but couldn't extract additional information. The curl tells you there's a vertical component, Kira explained. A slight updraft may be from thermal heating of that rock formation to our left. It's creating a lifting effect. If I'm shooting and my bullet crosses through that zone, it'll rise slightly more than my drop calculation predicts. I need to compensate. She scattered sand from different heights, demonstrating how the dispersion pattern changed with altitude. This shows you wind layers. Surface wind might be 5 miles per hour. Wind at 10 feet might be 8 miles per hour. Wind at 50 feet might be 4 miles per hour. Your bullet crosses all those layers. You need to account for all of them. Brennan pulled out a notebook and started sketching the patterns, trying to create a reference guide he could study later. Kira noticed and smiled. Don't just write it down, she said. Practice it. Do this every day, morning, noon, evening, night, in different weather conditions, different seasons. Your body needs to learn to read these patterns automatically without conscious thought. It needs to become instinct. They spent 3 hours in the desert that afternoon learning to read information they'd walked past their entire lives without seeing. The education was humbling. These were elite warriors, men who'd mastered complex skills and operated under extreme pressure. And they were struggling with observations that Kira made effortlessly. But they were learning. Slowly, incrementally, they were beginning to see the desert differently, not as empty wasteland, but as a complex system constantly providing information to anyone patient enough to observe. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and gold, Grant pulled Kira aside for a private conversation. I need to tell you something else about 1961, he said, his voice low. Something I learned when I accessed the classified files last month. Kira waited. The 4-man team they sent instead of your grandfather. They weren't just random SEALs. They were the top-rated long-range shooters in the Navy at that time. Multiple competition wins. Combat-confirmed kills at extreme distance. They were sent specifically because command wanted to prove that conventional military training was superior to Nathan's methodology. They wanted him to fail, Kira said slowly, understanding dawning. Or rather, they wanted to prove he would have failed. Exactly. When the mission went wrong, when all 4 missed, and the operation was compromised, they had a choice. They could admit that their best shooters had failed at a shot Nathan said was achievable. Or they could blame Nathan, claim his calculations were wrong, use him as a scapegoat to protect institutional reputation. They chose their reputation over the truth. They always do, Grant said bitterly. Institutions protect themselves first. Individuals are expendable. I've seen it play out dozens of times in my career. What makes this particularly bitter is that Nathan's calculations were absolutely correct. The 4 shooters missed because they ignored his wind analysis and relied on their own measurements. They had the technology, he had the knowledge. Technology failed, but they couldn't admit that. Kira looked out at the desert, at the landscape her grandfather had understood with such profound intimacy. Tomorrow's shot isn't really about me, is it? It's about all of us, Grant replied. About everyone who's ever been dismissed because they knew things that couldn't be quantified in an official report. Every specialist who was ignored by generalists. Every expert whose expertise didn't fit the institutional framework. Your grandfather represents all of them. That's a lot of weight to carry, Kira said quietly. You've been carrying it your whole life, Grant observed. Every time you picked up that rifle. Every time you practiced his techniques. Every time you added your own observations to the knowledge base. You've been preparing for tomorrow for 26 years. You're ready. That evening, the SEAL team gathered at their temporary quarters, reviewing the day's lessons and preparing for the following morning's final evaluation. The conversation was different than it had been 48 hours ago. The casual confidence had been replaced by thoughtful humility. I used to think experience and instinct were just words we used for pattern recognition. We couldn't explain scientifically, Mercer said, cleaning his rifle with methodical care. But watching her, learning from her, I'm realizing that explanation is backwards. Science is just our attempt to quantify and codify instinct and experience. We're trying to capture in formulas and data what people like Nathan Redwing understood directly. The technology isn't wrong, Ashford said. It's incomplete. It gives us pieces of the picture. But Kira sees the whole picture because she's trained to perceive information our instruments can't measure. Holloway sat apart from the group, writing in his personal journal. He was documenting everything, every lesson, every observation, every moment of realization. This experience was going to change how he taught, how he trained, how he led. He could feel that certainty in his bones. Sir, Brennan said, addressing Holloway formally. When we get back to base, I want to request authorization to develop a supplemental training program, combining our standard ballistic instruction with traditional fieldcraft observation. Not replacing our current methods, but enhancing them. Approved, Holloway said without hesitation. I'll co-sign the proposal. This needs to be integrated into our entire training pipeline. Callahan had been quiet for most of the evening, lost in his own thoughts. Finally, he spoke. My grandfather died when I was 18, right before I enlisted. Last conversation we had, he told me that the old ways of doing things weren't necessarily wrong, they were just different. Said I shouldn't be so quick to throw away knowledge, just because it seemed outdated. He paused, emotion thick in his voice. I wish I'd listened. I wish I'd asked him to teach me before it was too late. That knowledge died with him. It doesn't have to keep dying, Ashford said. That's what tomorrow's about, right? Proving that the old knowledge still has value, that it deserves to be preserved and passed on. Outside, the desert night was vast and clear, stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Somewhere in that darkness, Kira Redwing was preparing for the shot that would define not just her legacy, but her grandfather's. The shot that had waited 63 years to be taken. In her quiet hotel room, Kira sat cross-legged on the floor with the wooden rifle across her lap. She'd been meditating for over an hour, centering herself, preparing mentally for what dawn would bring. The blank space on the rifle stock seemed to glow in the lamplight, waiting to be filled. She thought about Nathan Redwing calculating that 800-meter shot in 1961, mapping every variable, preparing with such thoroughness that success seemed inevitable. She thought about him being told his services weren't needed, that military personnel would handle it, that his civilian status made him unsuitable for such a critical task. She thought about him watching that mission fail, watching men ignore his calculations and trust their own measurements, instead watching the entire operation collapse and then watching himself be blamed for the failure. She thought about him carrying that undeserved shame for the rest of his life, never defending himself, because the classification prevented him from speaking openly, never clearing his name, because the institution that wronged him held all the power. Tomorrow she would clear his name. Tomorrow she would hack the shot he'd been denied. Tomorrow she would prove that Nathan Redwing had been right all along. Her fingers traced the carvings on the rifle stock, reading the accumulated knowledge of 5 generations. Buffalo hunters in Montana, elk hunters in the Rockies, military contractors in Nevada. Each generation adding their observations, refining the calculations, passing the knowledge forward in the faith that someday it would matter. Tomorrow it would matter. I'm ready, grandfather, she whispered to the empty room. I'll finish what you started. I promise. The rifle seemed to warm under her hands as if acknowledging the promise. Or perhaps that was just her imagination, the hope that he was somehow still present, still guiding her, still teaching her the lessons he'd spent his life learning. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns. The desert held its breath. And dawn approached with the inevitability of justice too long delayed, but finally arriving. Tomorrow would bring the shot heard across generations. Tomorrow would bring vindication. Tomorrow would prove that some knowledge was too valuable to be buried, too true, to be dismissed, too powerful to be forgotten. Tomorrow, Nathan Redwing would be remembered. The final dawn arrived with a stillness that felt almost sacred. The sky transformed from deep indigo to pale rose, and the air held at exactly 71 degrees Fahrenheit. No wind disturbed the sand. No clouds marred the perfect clarity of atmosphere. It was as if the desert itself had been waiting for this moment, holding its breath for 63 years, until conditions aligned with such perfection that even chance seemed deliberate. Kira Redwing had not slept. She'd spent the night in meditation and prayer, speaking the old words her grandfather had taught her, words that connected her to ancestors who'd walked this land when it belonged only to sky and stone, and the people who understood both. She'd cleaned her rifle with ceremonial care, treating each component as if it were alive and aware. And she'd studied the blank space on the wooden stock, that empty section of walnut, that had waited since 1961 to be carved with the notation that would complete a story begun generations before her birth. Now she walked toward the range as the sun broke the eastern horizon, and her bare feet left impressions in sand that would vanish with the first thermal wind. She carried the wooden rifle like a prayer, like a promise, like the weight of accumulated history given physical form. The SEAL team stood at attention as she approached. Without discussion or command, they'd formed a line, and as Kira passed, each man rendered a salute. Not the casual acknowledgement of routine military courtesy, but the full formal salute reserved for honored dead and extraordinary occasions. Lieutenant Garrett Holloway's hand was steady at his brow. Chief Instructor Wade Brennan's jaw was tight with emotion. He didn't trust himself to speak. Petty Officer Kyle Mercer had set aside his kestrel, entirely trusting his eyes alone for what was to come. Senior Chief Boone Callahan's weathered face showed naked respect that 23 years as a SEAL hadn't taught him to hide. Petty Officer Trent Ashford stood silent and still witnessing what he somehow knew would be the most important moment of his military career. Colonel Thaddeus Grant held his camera ready, hands no longer trembling because purpose had steadied them. Commander Russell Hayes carried his clipboard, but the routine evaluation forms seemed suddenly inadequate to document what was about to unfold. Kira returned the salutes with a slight bow, a gesture that acknowledged their respect while honoring her own traditions. Then she walked to the firing line and set down her rifle with the same care someone might show placing a child in a cradle. The steel target at 3,800 meters was barely visible even through high-powered optics. 2.36 miles, 4,168 yards. A distance that exceeded confirmed military records, that pushed beyond the boundaries of what doctrine considered achievable, that represented the absolute edge of human capability merged with perfect conditions. Hayes cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the silent range. Ms. Redwing, before we begin, I need to formally state for the record the technical parameters you're facing. Kira nodded, giving him her full attention. At 3,800 meters, estimated bullet flight time is 7.3 seconds. Total vertical drop exceeds 53 feet. A wind reading error of just 2 miles per hour translates to over 6 feet of horizontal drift. Temperature variations of 5 degrees alter trajectory by multiple inches. Humidity, barometric pressure, even the Coriolis effect become significant factors. He paused, letting the weight of those numbers settle. Military doctrine classifies this shot as operationally inadvisable, with extremely low probability of success. I'm required to state that for official documentation. I understand, Commander, Kira said quietly. I also need to state, Hayes continued, and now his professional tone carried something that sounded like personal investment, that if you successfully execute this shot under proper observation, it will be documented as the longest confirmed precision rifle shot under controlled evaluation conditions. Your grandfather's methodology will be officially validated, and I will personally ensure that his service record reflects the truth of what happened in the 61. Grant stepped forward, camera raised. Everything will be recorded, multiple angles, continuous documentation from preparation through impact. This will be irrefutable evidence. Holloway spoke next, his voice steady despite the tension visible in his shoulders. Ma'am, regardless of outcome, what you've taught us over these past 2 days has fundamentally changed how we understand our craft. You've already proven everything that needs proving. Not everything, Kira replied, looking at the distant steel plate that shimmered in the morning light like a mirage. Not yet. She turned to face the assembled group, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 5 generations. My great-great-great-grandfather carved the first calculations into this rifle stock in 1850. He was teaching his knowledge to survive, to feed his family, to maintain his people's independence in a world that was trying to erase them. Every generation since has added to that knowledge, refined it, tested it against reality until it became something that couldn't be dismissed as luck or intuition. She touched the wooden stock with obvious love. My grandfather prepared for this exact shot in 1961. He spent 3 days mapping this desert, documenting every terrain, feature, calculating wind patterns hour by hour. He was ready, and they told him he wasn't needed. They sent trained professionals instead, and those professionals failed, and then they blamed him for their failure. The morning air seemed to grow heavier with the injustice of that statement. Today I'm not just taking a shot, Kira said. I'm finishing his work. I'm proving that what he knew was real and valuable and worthy of respect. I'm carving the final notation on this rifle that he left space for 63 years ago. And I'm doing it not because I want to prove I'm better than anyone, but because he deserves to be remembered correctly. Silence held for a long moment. Then Callahan spoke, his gravelly voice rough with emotion. Ma'am, we'll make sure he's remembered. You have my word on that. All of our words, Holloway added, and the other SEALs nodded agreement. Kira smiled, and some of the tension eased from her shoulders. Then let's begin. The preparation ritual began with her walking. Not the short reconnaissance movements of the previous days, but a full pilgrimage to the target itself. 3,800 meters. Over 2 miles across desert hardpan and sand through heat that was already building despite the early hour. The team watched her diminishing figure through spotting scopes. She walked with steady purpose, never hurrying, her attention fixed on the landscape around her. Every 100 meters, she would stop, kneel, press her hands to the earth. She was reading the terrain with tactile intimacy, learning its contours and textures, building a three-dimensional map in her mind that no survey equipment could replicate. "She's been walking for 40 minutes, Mercer said quietly, checking his watch. "She's learning," Ashford replied, watching through his scope. "Every step teaches her something about how the wind moves across this specific ground, where it accelerates, where it deflects, where it creates turbulence. By the time she gets back, she'll know this corridor better than most people know their own homes." At the target, Kira stood for a full 5 minutes, just looking back toward the firing line, seeing the shot from the bullet's perspective, understanding the journey the round would have to make. Then she knelt and placed something small at the base of the steel plate. Through the scope, Grant could just make it out. A small turquoise stone, traditional Cherokee marker of respect and intention. The walk back took another 40 minutes. When Kira returned to the firing line, her face showed the fatigue of covering nearly 5 miles on foot, but her eyes held absolute certainty. She'd gathered every piece of information the land could provide. Now came the integration, the synthesis of observation into action. She sat cross-legged beside her rifle and closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed until it was almost imperceptible. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The watching SEALs remained silent, understanding, without being told, that what they were witnessing was profound focus, the gathering of mental and physical resources for a task that would demand everything she possessed. When her eyes opened, they held a clarity that seemed almost luminous. She stood fluidly, removed her boots, and pressed her bare feet into the sand. The connection to earth, the completion of the circuit between land and body and rifle that her methods required. She pulled her leather pouch and scattered sand from 5 different heights at 7 different locations around the firing line. Each dispersal pattern told her something about wind layers, about atmospheric structure, about the invisible architecture of air that her bullet would have to navigate. She watched each pattern with such intensity that the grains seemed to slow in their fall, revealing secrets to eyes trained to perceive them. She tasted the air repeatedly, her expression showing subtle changes as she detected variations in humidity that instruments would measure in decimal points, but that her trained senses registered as qualitative differences. Dry air versus slightly less dry air versus air that carried the faintest ghost of moisture from some distant source. She listened to the desert silence, hearing within it the subtle sounds of wind moving across stone and sand and vegetation, the acoustic landscape that revealed pressure patterns and thermal currents in the shape of atmosphere itself. 40 minutes of preparation. 40 minutes during which she gathered data through methods that predated scientific instruments by thousands of years, methods that worked not despite their age, but because of it, because they'd been refined across countless generations into something approaching perfect efficiency. Finally, she knelt beside the wooden rifle. Her hands moved across it with ceremonial care, checking each component, ensuring mechanical perfection. She adjusted the bipod height with precision, measured in fractions of inches. She cleared the optic lens with a microfiber cloth, removing invisible dust that might scatter light at the critical moment. From a small case, she withdrew a single cartridge. The brass casing gleamed in the morning sun, and etched into its surface in fine script were 2 sets of initials and 2 dates: NR 1961, KR 2024. The round had been hand-loaded using her grandfather's exact powder formula, documented in his notes and preserved across 6 decades. The bullet was a 352 grain Sierra Match King, chosen for its ballistic coefficient and proven accuracy at extreme range. She chambered the round with smooth finality. The bolt closed with mechanical precision, and that small sound seemed to echo across the desert like a declaration. Now came the shot itself. Kira settled into her shooting position with the ease of someone who'd occupied this exact configuration 10,000 times. The wooden stock found her shoulder, her cheek pressed to walnut, worn smooth by generations of family, her eye aligned naturally with the scope. Through the optic, the steel plate at 3,800 meters appeared small and distant, wavering slightly in the thermal currents already beginning to build. She would have to hold her aim point 53 feet above that steel, trusting in calculations made not with computers, but with inherited knowledge and direct observation. Her breathing cycle began. 4 count in through the nose. Hold for 2. 4 count out through the mouth. Hold for 2. The rhythm slowed, her heart rate calmed, the sympathetic nervous system brought her body into the state of relaxed readiness that extreme precision demanded. The SEAL team watched in absolute silence. Holloway's hand gripped his binoculars until his knuckles showed white. Brennan had stopped breathing entirely, as if his respiration might somehow disturb the air between rifle and target. Mercer's eyes were fixed on Kira with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail of a moment he knew would define something fundamental. Callahan's lips moved in silent prayer words he hadn't spoken since childhood, returning unbidden. Ashford stood perfectly still, understanding in his bones that he was witnessing history. Grant's camera captured everything with mechanical precision, but his eyes above the viewfinder showed moisture that had nothing to do with the desert wind. Hayes held his clipboard, forgotten all pretense of clinical evaluation, abandoned in the face of something that transcended measurement. Kira's crosshair settled on her calculated aim point 53 feet above the distant steel. The hold was rock steady, the result of strength built through years of practice and a nervous system trained to absolute stillness. She waited through 2 complete breathing cycles, feeling the subtle pulse of wind, sensing the exact moment when all variables aligned in temporary perfection. In her mind, she heard her grandfather's voice from that morning in 1962. The last lesson before she'd understood it was a lesson. The final teaching before his death 7 years later. Watch the mesquite leaves. The wind tells you everything if you learn its language. She'd spent 26 years learning that language. 26 years of practice and observation and refinement. 26 years building toward this single moment when everything would either validate or invalidate not just her skill, but her grandfather's legacy. Her finger increased pressure on the trigger. Smooth and gradual, no jerk or flinch. Pure mechanical increase of force until the sear released and the firing pin fell. The wooden rifle spoke with that same deep resonance that seemed to carry the voice of every shot it had ever fired across nearly 2 centuries. The recoil was gentle against her shoulder, absorbed and controlled, and she remained in the scope, tracking, watching. The bullet left the barrel at 2,935 feet per second, spinning at 180,000 revolutions per minute, from the rifling stabilized in flight by that rotation. It carried 3,947 foot-pounds of energy and began immediately to surrender that energy to air resistance and gravity's patient pull. 7.3 seconds of flight across 2.36 miles. The bullet crossed through the first wind layer at 400 meters, the surface current pushing it right by calculated inches. At 800 meters, it transitioned into a second wind layer, moving at different velocity and slightly different angle, the cross current nudging trajectory left. At 200 meters, it reached maximum arc height and began its descent, fighting air resistance that increased with the square of velocity. At 800 meters, thermal currents rising from sunlit sand created updraft that lifted the bullet fractionally exactly as Kira had calculated, based on rock formation heating patterns she'd observed during her walk. At 400 meters, a small terrain depression created a downdraft zone, and the bullet dipped through it precisely as her preparation had predicted. At 3,000 meters, crosswind from a ridgeline deflected the trajectory. Right again, the bullet responding to atmospheric pressure variations invisible to instruments, but revealed through patient observation of vegetation movement. At 3,500 meters, the bullet had shed over 60% of its initial energy, but maintained stability through aerodynamic design in perfect initial conditions. At 3,800 meters, 7.3 seconds after leaving the barrel, the bullet arrived at its destination with 847 foot-pounds of energy still remaining. The steel plate rang with perfect center mass impact. The sound reached the firing line 4 seconds later, carried on the still morning air with absolute clarity. A metallic note that sang of vindication and justice and the validation of knowledge that had waited 6 decades to be proven. For a moment, nobody moved. The magnitude of what they'd witnessed required processing time that immediate celebration would have violated. This wasn't a sporting achievement or a technical accomplishment. This was something that reached deeper, touched something fundamental about respect and recognition and the debts that history owes to those it has wronged. Then Brennan's voice broke the silence, rough with emotion he'd stopped trying to hide. Confirmed. Dead center impact. Perfect shot. The dam broke. Holloway let out a breath he'd been holding for over 7 seconds and turned to Kira with an expression that mixed awe and respect in equal measure. That was, I don't have words adequate to describe what that was. Mercer had tears streaming down his face, making no effort to wipe them away. She did it. Holy God, she actually did it. Callahan dropped to both knees in the sand, his 43 years of military service, insufficient to provide a framework for processing what he'd just witnessed. I just watched impossible happen, he said to no one in particular. I'm going to remember this moment until the day I die. Ashford stood frozen, his mind already working through the implications, understanding that every sniper manual would need revision, that every training program would need updating, that the paradigm had shifted in ways that would take years to fully integrate. Grant lowered his camera with hands that now shook with released tension. He walked toward Kira, and when he reached her, he came to full attention and rendered the most perfect salute of his 39-year career. On behalf of the United States military, he said, his voice carrying formality that made the words almost ceremonial, on behalf of every soldier who believed that wisdom died with the old ways, on behalf of everyone who was dismissed because their knowledge couldn't be quantified in official reports, and most especially on behalf of your grandfather, Nathan Redwing, thank you. Thank you for proving that some truths are too powerful to remain buried. Kira stood from her shooting position, slowly safing her rifle with automatic care, setting it down gently. She faced east toward the distant grave where Nathan Redwing rested and placed her hand over her heart in the Cherokee gesture of completion and respect. We did it together, grandfather, she whispered. Across 63 years, we did it together. A single tear tracked down her cheek, carrying with it the weight of generational grief and pride and the quiet satisfaction of promises kept. Hayes approached clipboard, finally abandoned entirely, and extended his hand. When Kira shook it, he held the grip for a long moment, his eyes meeting hers with intensity that communicated what words couldn't adequately express. I'm officially certifying this evaluation, he said. 3 800 meters confirmed center mass impact, witnessed by SEAL Team sniper cadre and senior command staff. Multiple video documentation. This becomes part of official military record. He paused, then added with personal conviction that went beyond professional duty. And I'm submitting my report about your grandfather today. With Colonel Grant's documentation and your demonstration, we have everything needed to correct his service record. It won't be fast, but it will happen. That's my word. Thank you, Commander, Kira said quietly. That means more than you know. She returned to her rifle and pulled a small leather case from her pack. From it, she withdrew a carving tool, the same implement her grandfather had used, worn smooth from decades of patient work. She settled cross-legged in the sand with the rifle across her lap and began to carve. The SEAL team watched in respectful silence as she added the final notation to the wooden stock. Distance 3 800 Malum. Date November 21st, 2024. Initials NR plus care, and beneath those practical details a Cherokee symbol that Grant recognized from his studies. The mark that meant completion of interrupted journey. When she finished, she held the rifle up so the morning sun illuminated the carvings. 5 generations of accumulated knowledge from 1850 to 2024. 174 years compressed into walnut wood, and now finally complete. This rifle has work left, she said, addressing the group, but not mine. It goes home now, above the fireplace. The story is finished. Will you teach us more? Holloway asked, and the question carried weight beyond simple curiosity. Formally, I mean, as part of our training curriculum. What you know, what your grandfather knew, it needs to continue. It's too valuable to die with one person. Kira looked at each of them in turn, seeing in their faces genuine hunger to learn, authentic respect for knowledge they'd initially dismissed. Yes, she said simply, my grandfather would have wanted his understanding to survive, to grow, to help others. I'll teach anyone who approaches with respect and genuine desire to learn. We'll approach with both, Brennan promised, and the others nodded agreement. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the desert, beginning to create the thermal distortions that would make shooting impossible until evening. But the work was done. The shot that had waited 63 years had been taken. The record that had been wrong for 63 years would be corrected. The knowledge that had been dismissed for 63 years had been validated beyond any possible dismissal. Justice delayed, but finally arriving. 3 months later, the wooden rifle hung above Kira's fireplace, its carvings catching afternoon light that streamed through windows overlooking Cherokee land. The blank space was no longer blank. The final notation gleamed with fresh oil, 3800 mm, NR plus KR, November 21st, 2024. The phone rang. Lieutenant Holloway's voice carried excitement she'd rarely heard from him. Kira, it's official. Nathan's service record was amended yesterday. Defense Distinguished Service Medal approved. And there's more. We've integrated your grandfather's methods into SEAL Sniper curriculum. Mandatory module. Red Wing environmental observation techniques. Every operator will learn his name. Kira touched the rifle stock gently. He would have liked that it helps people. Our hit rate at extreme distance improved 47%. Holloway continued. 47. You didn't just prove a point. You changed how we fight. After the call ended, Kira walked outside. The wind moved through Oklahoma grassland the way it had moved through Arizona desert. Different terrain, same language. She closed her eyes and listened, reading patterns Nathan had taught her to perceive. A car pulled up. Colonel Grant, now retired, stepped out carrying a folder. The Smithsonian exhibit opens next week, he said. They've recreated the Arizona range. Your grandfather's story, the 3,800-meter shot, the methodology. And they asked me to give you this. He handed her a letter, the Pentagon seal pressed into wax. She read it twice, then looked up with eyes that held tears she didn't wipe away. They're naming the program after him, she said quietly. The Nathan Red Wing Fieldcraft Initiative. DOD-wide. Not just SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Scout snipers. Everyone. Grant's voice was thick. 63 years late, but it's there now, permanent record. No one can erase it again. That evening, Kira returned to the Arizona range one final time. The steel plate at 3,800 meters still stood baking under desert sun. She walked to it without rifle, just her feet and the land and memories. At the target, she found the turquoise stone she'd placed months ago. Still there, waiting. She knelt and spoke in Cherokee words her grandfather had taught her for honoring those who'd passed. Then she added her own. They remember you now, grandfather, not because I made them, because you were right and truth doesn't stay buried forever. Your shot is finished. Your name is known. Your knowledge lives. The wind answered, moving through creosote and sage the way it had that morning in 1962 when a 6-year-old girl first learned to listen. She stood, placed a second stone beside the first, and walked back toward the firing line. 2 miles of desert stretched before her, and she knew every inch now. Knew where wind accelerated and where it stalled. Knew which plants marked thermal zones and which rocks created deflection patterns. She knew because he'd taught her to see. At the firing line, 3 young people waited, SEAL candidates who'd requested private instruction. 2 men, 1 woman. The woman, Sarah Whitfield, stood at attention as Kira approached. Ma'am, we're ready to learn. Kira smiled, seeing in their faces the same hunger that had driven her to master skills everyone said were obsolete. Then let's begin. Remove your boots. Feel the earth. The first lesson is listening. They obeyed without question, and as the sun painted the desert in amber and gold, Kira taught them to scatter sand and read its dispersion, to taste humidity on the air, to hear wind layers in the silence. The old ways passed to new hands. The desert watched, patient as always, holding secrets for those disciplined enough to learn its language. And somewhere beyond sight, but perhaps not beyond feeling, an old Cherokee man rested easy, his work completed by the granddaughter, who'd promised to finish what he had started. The shot was taken. The name was honored. The knowledge survived. The rest was just wind and sand and time teaching anyone willing to listen.